Hello, and welcome to this bite-sized PD video by Designed for Learning. My name is Susan Stewart, and I'm an instructional technology coach from Central California. In this video, we're going to talk about primary level geometry concepts using a free resource for teaching, the Math Learning Center. This free set of tools is awesome because the apps provide an easy, fun way for students to practice building math models to help develop conceptual understanding of math concepts like geometry. Some math concepts are so abstract and intangible. The Math Learning Center makes math learning real and meaningful. Our plan in this video is to do a quick walkthrough of one of the Math Learning Center apps, the GeoBoard. We'll explore how this tool can be used by primary educators to reinforce geometry lessons and give students additional creative and engaging practice on geometry skills. Your students will love the GeoBoard. So here we are at the Math Learning Center, and I see a number of tools listed, and I see a wide variety of math tools. Now, as I look at each tool, I notice a couple things. I see that they're available as a web app. There is an iOS app that can be downloaded for many of these. So if your students have iPads, you can download a standalone app for each of these, and they're also available as Chrome apps. Today in the GeoBoard, we're going to open the web app. That means this will work in any modern browser. I'll open it up. And what you see here might look like something you've had in your classrooms before. I know I used to have GeoBoards in my classroom, and the students loved playing with them. Now, one challenge we ran into when using GeoBoards in the classroom was the rubber bands. And every time I'd pull out that bag of rubber bands, the rubber bands would be old and breaking. I love the fact that I can substitute that activity with this digital version. I'm not going to run out of rubber bands. They're not going to be flying around the room, and none of them are going to break on my students. I see here I have my GeoBoard, and I notice a few tools at the bottom. I can change the canvas size. I can make a larger GeoBoard, or I can even make a round GeoBoard. But let's just start by playing with it. When I give students a new tool, sometimes I just give them a chance to push all the buttons. They discover ideas and concepts just by playing with it. So the idea here is that I get a rubber band and I place it somewhere on the GeoBoard, and I can slide it around to build some kind of math model. Now I can take these and stretch them out. So one way I might build something like a rectangle is to use 4 colors and build it there. Now I can do this with a single rubber band too. Check this out. I'm going to come to the bottom here, and I'm going to zoom in on that so you can see it. Here at the bottom, I have a refresh button. When I press that, everything will reset. Let me go ahead and go back to that refresh reset button. And it says, do you want to clear all your work? It gives me a little warning here, and I'm going to clear it out. And now I'm going to grab a single rubber band and stretch it, but I notice that I can pull it to make it go over here. And that's nice because it helps your students see how shapes develop as we're building here. So I started by just building a simple rectangle. If I have students in pre-K, I may just let my pre-K students draw lines, try to make straight lines, talk about a big line and a little line. Maybe I might have my pre-K students just practice building things like letters, perhaps, out of the rubber bands. We might give our students opportunities to tinker and play. When we're first learning a new tool, the play part is very important because that allows our students to get comfortable with the tool before we start adding the heavy cognitive load of the lesson. But now, as we continue on, and I'm in my kindergarten classes, I may want to start having my students build shapes. We can use the rubber bands again, and we can start building things like squares and rectangles. And of course, we know the concept of a square is that all sides have the same length. So we can look at the difference between a square and a rectangle side by side. And some learners might start to notice how these two shapes, notice how 2 sides are the same. They have 4, but these ones are longer, and that makes it a rectangle. So just a little bit of simplicity with building shapes. Now we could go a little further with some learners, and they might start to notice that if I have 2 squares side by side, sometimes they make a similar shape. That concept of putting shapes together and taking them apart, that's a really great way for our students to start understanding how shapes put together build other shapes and how shapes sitting side by side, right? That spatial awareness of how things work together. So I can, in kindergarten, have my students build some simple shapes. Maybe we start with some triangles too, understanding that shapes have 4 sides or 3 sides, and really just interacting and playing with some of these shapes. Now, continuing on. So moving into first grade, we might have some different expectations for what our students do with shapes. I might have my students build a shape, and I'm going to go ahead and build a square here, and I might ask my students to build a square. I may predefine the length. Maybe I might tell them to build one with a certain number of lengths on the side. I might predetermine that, but then I might provide a challenge. I say, okay, build a shape that has this many on the side, maybe it's 8 across or 6 across, and then use another rubber band to cut it in half. Make sure that both sides are equal. So I have my students build a shape, and maybe that's a square, maybe that's a rectangle, and have them see how many different ways they can cut it in half. So they might notice that I can cut it in half this way, or that I can cut it in half this way as well. I have 2 different ways there I might cut it in half. Or some students might start to recognize that if I cut on the diagonal, that is a half too. So playing with shapes and cutting them into equal parts is something I might do with my students in first grade. Now, a question that starts coming up here as I clear this out is, well, how do I get this to my learners in the first place? If I want my students to play with this on their app, they would simply just load an app on iOS. If they have iPads, they just open up the app. But I can also have my students access this by copying this URL, this address. It's apps.mathlearningcenter.org/geoboard. And I can post that wherever I might give my students links. Maybe that's in Clever, in Google Classroom, in Seesaw. Wherever you post things for learners, that's where you can put this. But wherever you give your learners links, you just post that for them to play with. And you can give them some of those challenges, like create a triangle, create a shape that has 3 sides, create a shape that has 4 sides. And maybe we might start getting creative and might say, create a shape that has 5 sides. And you'll see how your students start to interact with this, and they may start realizing how they can create additional shapes beyond the basics. So really fun, simple way to get our students interacting with shapes and geometry. So in second grade, we might take this even further. We're continuing to develop those concepts of shapes and how shapes put together make other shapes. So I might have my students start working on developing their spatial awareness, the ability to break something into equal pieces. Like, how might I break this into equal pieces? I can take this, and if we just start giving students the chance to play with it, what if I put straight lines here? How many equal pieces can I cut it this way? Or maybe what if I put the lines up and down? How many equal pieces can I make? As we continue on, you can see there's some foundations being set for early ideas in area, right? Because as I break this down into individual sections, my students might start noticing these little square units, right? So we can start really playing with some of these geometry concepts, getting our hands on them, talking about equal parts, talking about shapes together, talking about putting shapes together, taking shapes apart, lots of fun that can be had. Another feature of the GeoBoard is the labeling feature. I'm going to go ahead and make another triangle here. And of course, I know my triangle has 3 sides, but notice that there's a T-text tool that allows me to type. So I might say triangle, and I might say 3 sides. I can change the color here and hit done. I can resize this and move it. And now I've created a label for this. I have a triangle, it has 3 sides. So as my learners continue on with their experience, we can go even further by having them identify some of the attributes of these shapes. If I want my students to capture this somehow, on an iPad, I can of course take a screenshot. But if I'm working from Chromebooks or other devices, my students have some additional sharing options. I might use the share button at the bottom. So when students push that share arrow, they get some options of how to capture this. The Math Learning Center will let my students save this as an image, or they can copy this image to use somewhere else. So maybe they might copy it and go paste it into another tool, perhaps like a Seesaw or a Google Slide for sharing later. Lots of ways my students can share this learning to me as well. So I hope you enjoyed that little tour talking about how we might use the Math Learning Center to teach some mathematical concepts.